What's up, everybody? Welcome back, and today we're going to be discussing the WPMCs in action. This is the new faction added to squad with version 8.1. So if you're new here, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below, and let me know what your favorite weapon has been to try out from the WPMC faction. So real quick, I'd like to throw out a shout out to anybody that went and checked out our previous video, the one on version 8.1 coming to squad. It went absolutely nuts. It's over 165,000 views, and on this channel that is massive considering we're still a relatively new and small channel. So thank you all for the support. So we've already talked about the update itself, but today I actually wanted to focus a little bit more on how this faction plays out in game. So in the last couple days, I've been putting a lot of time in as the WPMC faction, trying to get my bearings, checking out the different weaponry and how it's going to work on the battlefield. So one of the main things that stands out to me and probably stands out to you is just the variety of weaponry that the faction has and how it's very adaptable to any given map or situation, terrain, whatever. You have something that you can alternate to, especially if you're something like a rifleman with 9 different kits. If one gun isn't working for you in that particular environment, you can quickly switch it to something else. For example, if you start off with the MP5 and you feel like it's a little bit too close range for the map you are on or the environment you're playing within on that map, you can switch to something like the M14 if you want something with a little bit more range and power. The access this faction has to different weaponry and its ability to adapt to different situations is significant, and it does give this faction a pretty distinct advantage over some other factions. And it's not just weaponry, it's also the scopes that you might want to use. You can kind of switch weaponry, but also adjust your scope. Maybe you want to move away from an ACOG and you want to go to a red dot. There are options there for you to play with. Now, I have found myself enjoying a couple of the guns. I like the AK-101, but I don't like it with the ACOG scope. I've enjoyed using the M14 battle rifle, but it's very situational for me. The MP5 is also pretty situational. In close range, that thing is going to slap, but in something where you're going to end up in a little bit more of a medium to long distance fight, I'm going to hesitate using it for that. So the options and the adaptability this faction has also lends itself to the speed that they operate with, and the WPMCs have a ton of speed. With their assortment of light vehicles, including techies and CPVs, you're going to be able to move soldiers into different positions pretty quickly. The CPVs hold quite a few people too, and you can actually get those guys into areas to cause disruptions very quickly. Now, the CPV doesn't have the best steering, but it does have really solid straight line speed. This is sort of comparable to how you can use G-Wagons as the Canadian Armed Forces, but with the WPMCs, you can put more bodies at those extended positions away from your main. That's largely what I'm seeing is teams actually sending a lot of those CPVs out. You'll have a couple helping to backcap, but you'll see several moving out to just sort of create harassment points for enemy infantry or enemy armor and logistics. That could include even sending a Loach scout helicopter out with a couple AT or an AT and a rifleman, dropping them off behind enemy lines or near a main artery road just to slow down some of those vehicles from getting to wherever they are headed. And I think that speed and your ability to sort of extend infantry away from your main towards further objectives is important for this faction because there is no real wrecking ball of IFVs rolling up to kind of solidify anything. So I think it's important to get your enemy infantry in place with your AT and whatever assets you can, whether that's a tow or a Humvee tow, in position to really cause a lot of harm, to make it really difficult for the enemy infantry to push objectives by being there first and sort of creating a little bit of a meat grinder, if you can, to slow down their ability to really attack an objective. Now, right now with the WPMCs, everyone's trying the new gun, so there's a lot of infantry teamwork happening. You'll see extra bodies out on the field just running towards objectives. It's been kind of fun, but some of that is a byproduct of everyone wanting to try new weaponry and get an idea for what the infantry is capable of. But simultaneously, I think this is also something we'll see long-term with this faction, is a heavy-duty reliance on infantry teamwork. A variety of kits and things that you have at your disposal to help attack an enemy objective or just defend, because you don't have some of those IFVs to help cover certain things or participate in the fights. You are reliant on infantry, and strong infantry at that. With a variety of weapons, you are flexible, meaning you can have infantry actually holding certain buildings and stuff like that without really being a detriment to the team, while you have guys with MP5s running through these tight streets or alleyways. And the point is that as you become better with some of the weaponry, right, and you start choosing what you're going to typically run with within the WPMC faction, you might find things where you have one guy that's really focused on that tight infantry combat, that CQB, whereas you have that other guy that is just great with M14. You start intermixing these type of things and you can cover a lot of ground and different types of terrain. And I think for this faction to be really successful, that's what's going to be required, is just a high level of infantry teamwork. That, along with the speed we mentioned earlier, being able to sort of coordinate, work together with the variety of weapons you have, you're going to be able to cover some ground and really lock down lanes that the enemy is trying to push. I think this faction lends itself to just being a nuisance in multiple different areas and making it really difficult for enemy infantry and to some extent vehicles to progress very smoothly. Now, one more big positive that I want to talk about before I get into some drawbacks would be the mobile spawn vehicle. Now, not only is this thing cool in concept, it works very well if done very carefully. If you are throwing this vehicle out into the wild and losing 20 tickets on repeat, it's gonna suck, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But what I think is great about it is using it as sort of a backup defensive position, or maybe an attack position going opposite of where you're sending a lot of your infantry, right? To create two options for where you can spawn. It's a little bit low overhead in terms of how much time it takes to get going. You don't have to set down a radio, then build the hab. It's consolidated into that vehicle. Now, there are options for this vehicle and how it can be used to really set the WPMCs up very well. But the problem is that if it sits too long in an area, it is going to get hunted down by the enemy team because they know the 20 ticket value. It's something where you almost need a few guys just dedicated to the vehicle and the vehicle's safety, just to reposition it occasionally and move it into areas just to get a different sort of attack wave going with your infantry. Now let's talk about a few drawbacks or things you need to be aware of when using this faction. We just talked about the mobile spawn vehicle, and I think it's important to bring up a couple of things. This thing is worth 20 tickets. It is very valuable to your team to keep it alive, not only for the tickets, but also the fact that it's got like a 15-minute respawn. So if it gets killed, it's out, and you lose something that is specific to this faction that can really set the faction apart from whoever you're playing. But you do have to be mindful because enemy teams are hunting this vehicle. The problem that I see is some teams are letting it sit in main for long durations at a time, which is sort of counterproductive in a sense. The longer you let the vehicle sit in main, potentially the more map control enemy teams can gain, even if they're not even looking for the vehicle. But they likely are going to be searching for it, or keeping in mind that it is going to exist somewhere on the battlefield. I've even seen airstrikes used against it, which is pretty logical considering how many tickets it's valued at, plus its respawn timer. So to be clear, the drawback isn't the vehicle. The drawback is how it's utilized if used poorly, because I think there's a very fine line. The vehicle can't sit still for very long. You need to keep it mobile. You also may need a couple bodies trying to make sure that they have tabs on it to keep it in a situation where it's not super exposed to enemy infantry or enemy armor. Some of the best use so far that I've seen of this vehicle is just keeping it somewhat mobile. Park, get a flood of respawns in, and then move it quickly, because enemies are either going to be chasing the respawns or they're going to listen out for that vehicle and try to push it. So we talked about speed as an advantage, but let's talk about the flip side of that. Sometimes in rounds, I'm seeing a lack of connective tissue from the WPMC main to the defensive position to the attacking position. There's typically not a strong defensive setup. So while I'm seeing a lot of WPMC rollouts utilizing that speed to project enemy infantry, there seems to be a lackluster interest in playing some form of defense. Now, many of you will say that's pretty common in squad, but it seems to be slightly exaggerated with this faction. And again, I will reference the fact that enemy teams might have IFVs or stronger armor presence, being able to push infantry back or consolidate them around a specific objective, limiting their ability to sort of spread out and hold positions. So I've seen a lot of rounds go like this, where the WPMC faction rolls out, they actually back cap and move forward quicker, but then about halfway through the round, they're losing their caps very quickly because their infantry gets displaced and they don't have sort of the backbone that they need to hold the next defensive objective. But of course, I will note that some of that could be a byproduct of people wanting to force these weapons into gunfights to try them out, testing out new things and all that jazz, so hopefully it'll balance out as people become more familiar with the faction. I would just note that while you have a ton of speed, it is important still to have some sort of coverage and map control of defensive objectives as well as what you're doing on attack. Now, the next drawback I want to reference is their vehicles and their overall strength. I'll say this is more of a disadvantage for the faction, because I think drawback is going to get taken out of context a little bit. I'm not saying the faction sucks because their vehicles are primarily light vehicles utilized for infantry transport. But what I mean is that they sort of have a disadvantage in the IFV fight, which I think is pretty common knowledge. This is going to often create asymmetrical fights, especially with conventional forces. You are going to be outnumbered. They are going to have IFVs and you will not. You're going to have an M60 tank that may have to go against something like an Abrams or a T90 or whatever the enemy faction is going to have, and you will likely have issues dealing with that, especially if the other faction is an armored group with multiple tanks. This disadvantage is sort of built into the faction. And again, it's not that the faction sucks, because I don't think that at all. I think we just have to figure out and learn how to use the faction differently. It is going to require teams to understand how to spread out infantry and really sort of harass enemy armor and slow them down. Make them have a really tough time pushing objectives. And I've already seen some success stories with that, where Lats and Hats are moving forward in CPVs, sneaking up as close as they can to main MSRs and waiting for those vehicles to pull up. I've already seen the scout helicopter dropping off AT and a rifleman somewhere near a tree line where they can kind of hunker down and wait for vehicles to pull up near an objective. And again, you do need to be careful with these vehicles because the deaths can add up. If you consistently are sending vehicles down main roads and arteries and they are just getting destroyed, that ticket count is going to be a problem. There are some factions, including the WPMC, and there's going to be some unit types that you just can't operate like a conventional force. You can't operate like you have an LAV to come back you up, or a tank, or a couple of tanks in the field that can do something to shift the tide. And I think that's an interesting thing about why this faction is really appealing, because it does have certain tools and certain things that can be utilized to maybe give itself an advantage, but it requires a different type of play, which I think is important to sort of mix up how we go about rounds and how we participate during a round of squad. With that said, I hope you enjoy this quick look at the WPMC faction, some of its in action and advantages and disadvantages, how it's sort of operating. And again, I want to be very clear. I don't think this is a bad faction by having disadvantages. Every faction should have those. Not every faction should be balanced across the board, but it should result in a different way of play. And I think that little bit of variety in terms of how factions can work is important for the game. So if you like the video, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below again with what your favorite weaponry is as infantry from the WPMC faction, and I'll catch you next time.